Good morning, everyone. I'm Lori Crouch with the Education Writers Association. You've joined us for this very important session. I'm pleased also to introduce David Pluviose, who is the Executive Editor of Diverse Issues in Higher Education, who will moderate the session for the next 45 minutes. Take it away, David.
Thank you so much, Lori. Thank you so much for the invitation. It is good to be with you. Before we get started, I just want to start with a few housekeeping notes for all attendees. To the right of your video feed, there is a chat box. We'd love for you to introduce yourself in the chat box and use it to send any comments you may have throughout this session. Secondarily, if you have a question for any of our panelists, please use the Q&A tab located to the left of the polls tab to submit a question. An EWA staffer will be monitoring these questions and will facilitate the Q&A portion at the end of this session. Also, if you're going to tweet about this, please use the hashtag EWA Pathways, hashtag EWA Pathways. Finally, a reminder that everything is on the record, even our chats. So this session is being recorded. And following the session, I want to invite all attendees to rate the session. There will be an opportunity to do so right below where the video appears. Please do let us know what you think. I'd like to welcome all of you and introduce our outstanding panel for this session. First, I want to introduce Melissa Johnson. Melissa Johnson is Director of State Strategies at the National Skills Coalition. Welcome, Melissa. Next, we have Tomas Monarrez. He is a research associate in the Center on Education Data and Policy at the Urban Institute. Thank you for joining us, Tomas. And I believe Dr. Verret is on his way. We look forward to his participation in this panel. He is the 6th president and the 2nd lay leader of Xavier University of Louisiana. And so I believe Dr. Verret will be joining us shortly, but I want to kick this off and get going. In this particular session, we're talking about race, racism, and career pathways. It's interesting, much has been done with regards to helping underrepresented students, helping first-generation students, helping underprivileged students attain a higher education. There have been a number of programs and strategies to level the playing field, to take the money out the equation. If there is a talented high school student, many institutions have taken to providing full financial aid packages, bridge programs, trying to level the playing field, basically to tap the homegrown talent, irrespective of income and background. But one of the things that we are seeing amid this pandemic is further segregation when it comes to higher education. And this segregation has implications for the workforce, in so much majority students of privilege are the ones who have access to higher education. What we're going to see is majority students become a majority workforce, having the jobs that are paying great wages, having the elite positions. And some of the concern is that low-income students, first-generation students, underrepresented students fall completely out of the higher ed equation. And in this session, I'd like to talk a little bit about what the data is saying with regards to segregation in higher education and the resulting workforce, and what we can do about it. I want to first start with Tomas. Tomas, you released a report very recently, which had some interesting statistics, basically noting that when you look at majors in higher education, who is majoring in what, right? White students, Hispanic students, Black students. The report observed that white students are equally represented, pretty much among all majors, right? And so, of course, the question is, all right, who is going to be represented as engineers and computer science? You know, you'll have somewhat of a balanced representation for white students. But what the report observed from what I saw was that when it came to Hispanic and Black students, they were, I would say, not crowded, but yes, they were kind of going towards specific majors and not represented in other majors. And so, Tomas, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the data is saying with regards to higher education segregation, and what implications do you see in the workforce based on this latest data that you had looked at?
Yes, thank you so much, David, and thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to sit in this panel. So in this report that you were mentioning, we just released it at the beginning of this month. So this is a report about segregation inside colleges, right? So I think it's first important, I think, to kind of take a step back and think about all this racial inequality in this country that takes place kind of like at every juncture of the pipeline that takes you, from birth, education to the labor force and, your adulthood outcomes. So we had a report earlier in the summer this year kind of talking about how there is segregation between colleges, right? So different groups aren't really attending the same institutions. That's a whole other question by itself. This last report in December that came out is more about once we have a given mix of students that are an entering cohort for a given 4-year college, thinking about how they sort into different majors and fields of study, right? And just like David was saying, we found that while white students tend to be fairly represented, if you have a college that is 50% white, then on average, those majors within the college will be about 50% white, give and take a few percentage points, right? But when you look at students of color, at Black students, at Hispanic students, at Asian students, very different story, right? We have that Asian students are very overrepresented in the STEM fields, and Black and Hispanic students, we tend to be more underrepresented in those STEM fields and more overrepresented in other areas. And kind of the big takeaway from our report there is sort of just showing that for a given college with a given racial overall composition, if that college is more segregated, what is more common, more Black or Hispanic segregated, what is more common is that it's graduating fewer students of color with these high-paying degrees in the STEM and engineering fields, right? It could be the case instead that having a segregated college meant that we have all Black physicists and all Black chemists and all the folks of color in STEM, but that does not seem to be the case in the data. It seems to be the other way around, and we think that this is helping exacerbate income inequality. So that's kind of the finding there, which is really interesting. It's worrisome, especially now with the pandemic. The data that we have has nothing to do with the pandemic. We can only expect that these inequalities would maybe worsen.
And Melissa, I was wondering if you might be able to weigh in on this issue. Of course, last year, there was a report that you released, the roadmap for racial equity. And of course, there were some similar themes to what Tomas has just discussed in terms of disparities in higher education attainment for underrepresented minorities. And of course, all this data was before the pandemic. And everything that we have seen has indicated that segregation is worsening, right? If I am underrepresented, underprivileged, first generation, I'm not seeing college as a viable option. I just need to get a job so I can eat. Melissa, I was wondering to talk a little bit about some of the data that you crunched for that report, and perhaps what you have seen since, especially as we talk about the effects of the pandemic.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be on this this panel with all of these panelists. Like you said, we, just to take a step back to National Skills Coalition is focused on making sure that every worker in every industry have the skills that they need to compete and prosper. And we focus specifically on, hone in specifically on skills training. So training for jobs that require and careers that require training beyond high school, but not a 4-year degree. So that's our area of focus. And what we found in that report, of course, unfortunately is no surprise in that there are racial disparities in educational attainment at different levels of educational attainment, right? So even at the associate's degree levels, we see fewer Black students, we see fewer Brown students, we see fewer Indigenous students achieving that educational attainment level. And we also see Black and Latino students being more likely to be enrolled in some certificate and associate's degree programs. And as you said, David, unfortunately, the pandemic is only exacerbating some of these inequalities and inequities. We see that community college enrollment, once again, given our focus, is down 9.5%. And then when you look specifically at underrepresented racial minorities, they're down even further, like 30%. And even when you looking, as you said, people usually get into education to get that job, right? To get a higher paying job, to improve their lot, right? And at every level, so from certificates, associate's degrees, every level, we know through our friends at the Georgetown Center for Education and the Workforce that white workers are more likely to have good paying jobs at every level of education. And the pandemic is exacerbating those inequalities because just two factors I'll highlight really quickly because there are a few, but two of them. The higher cost of tuition. Community college, even since like the Great Recession, like community college tuition has increased over 20% in the past decade. So the decision is tougher for folks financially right now. And all of those jobs that people were working to pay for college, right? A significant number of those jobs are gone because of where we are in our economy. Over 50 million Americans have lost their jobs. So that's one huge factor, higher cost of tuition. And then another huge factor is the hurdles, the supports that students need. The hurdles are fundamentally different in this COVID economy. I won't even say post-COVID because we're still in it. So broadband access to devices, given how we're even doing this panel today, that is paramount. And we know that there are disproportionate access to a computer and to broadband specifically for Black and Indigenous students. And then childcare is another support that's needed and a hurdle that I'll lift up. Like 1 in 5 community college students are parents. And we know that childcare demands are different right now because a lot of childcare centers have closed down. And then schooling may be virtual for older children. They may be at home, learning virtually, and that requires parental support in a lot of cases. So the hurdles that students are being asked to leap over are different in this recession, in addition to the hurdle of tuition.
Dr. Verret, I wanted to ask you a question about, to comment on some of the things that have been spoken on, but specifically, Dr. Verret, much has been done with regards to leveling the playing field for first generation students, for underprivileged students. We have seen many colleges, for instance, offer full financial aid for students whose families are making under $80,000. We see bridge programs, we see programs like Posse. There's been some progress in terms of tapping homegrown talent, irrespective of their backgrounds, to enroll in colleges and have the opportunity to fill these high wage jobs that we are seeing segregation. And I was wondering if you could comment on what you are seeing with regards to the pandemic. It appears that in this current crisis, many institutions, of course, are looking at survival. And some of the concern, I believe, is that progress on diversity might regress, and we might end up with increasing segregation in the workforce. I was wondering if you could talk about what you're seeing with regards to these issues of segregation in higher education, and any thoughts you might have about the pandemic's impact on substantial efforts to achieve equity, not only in higher education, but in the workforce, the resultant workforce.
I think clearly the pandemic is showing the socioeconomic problems that are linked, that risk that many of our students face. The pandemic is showing an exacerbation in the stress on lower socioeconomic groups, and students of color make up a large portion of those groups. So what we're seeing already is that the application rates to college by students of color have declined due to the pandemic. Not surprising whether that will persist afterwards, but what we will see is a cascading effect. But I think one of the larger problems of equity, even though we've had, as you mentioned, there have been many efforts to address first generation students, students of lower socioeconomic needs in many colleges. Many of the colleges do not have the deep pockets to do what some of our leading institutions do. So that's one issue. But the larger issue, I think, is that if what Tomas is speaking about, the segregation of education and with of educational specialties in colleges around the country, and understand what we're seeing in STEM is not new, because if we go back 30, 40 years ago, the low underrepresentation in STEM fields in the single digits of Black students and also Hispanic students has improved only marginally, not significantly. I think the larger piece of that the miracle does not happen at the college level. We have an issue that is developing very early throughout our K-12 structures. We have a bifurcation of K-12 education. There are grade schools and there are less than grade schools, and the majority of American kids, both Black and whites, go to the less than grade schools. That's one issue. I think there are some things that also need to be addressed in early childhood education, which some cities are trying to do, that really need to be had, because that's not equitably available to all families. So I'm taking a longer look to see that the solution to what I'm seeing occurring on our college campuses begins by some hard work and I'm talking about hard work that has to be done early. And the larger piece also is thinking about that, even how we educate and form and the structure of our K-12 schools, the expectations that they have of these students that are communicated in less than verbal ways of this is what we do, this is what we do not do, is cascading and showing up in our choice of our majors as students are coming to college campuses. So there's a large piece of work to seeing the talent and the gifts that are present in our young kids and how we bring them up to actually consider those make those choices. And if we look more closely, that we will see that students, predominantly white school systems, provide different expectations in other school systems. And that's a legacy that goes back more than 100 years here in this country.
Now, the other interesting part, Melissa, you spoke about what's happening specific to community college tuition and community college enrollment. We spoke before, in typical economic recessions, we usually see an increase in community college enrollment. That's just typically what has happened. But the latest reports and stories I've seen are about students falling out of higher education altogether, right? Some alarming statistics in terms of students not pursuing any sort of higher education, even credentials or any pathways to a sustainable job. And so, Melissa, I was wondering if you talk a little bit about historically what we have seen with regards to, let's say, community college enrollment in a economic recession, and what is happening now, and what is the solution? How is it possible to encourage more students to see value in higher education? Because I think that value proposition has not been made significantly to some of these students. I was wondering if you talk about what's happened historically and what's happening now with regards to, for instance, community college enrollment.
Yeah. So, of course, you're exactly right. When historically we've seen people enroll in community college and in training when we're in an economic downturn, a recession, because students say to themselves, you know, this would be a great time to go to school, kind of wait this recession out, and hopefully by the time I'm done with my training, the economy will be in a better place. What we're seeing now, though, is disturbing because we're seeing declines in enrollment, and that's for a number of reasons, right? Getting back to how this recession is fundamentally different from previous recessions, right? We're all training and working, for those of us who still have the privilege of having jobs, we're training and working remotely, right? So that affects the way that people perceive training, right? They may think of college in their mind as a place where I go physically and I learn, and they might not be as comfortable with remote learning and remote training. There's also, and part of that comfort level is we talk a lot about, or a significant amount in this time, about digital access. And I even talked about it in response to your first question, but there's a digital literacy component to this, right? Folks may not be as comfortable with registering for classes online, or knowing that they're going to have to participate in classes online and try to vie for a professor's attention or receive training that they had once perceived as hands-on online. So there needs to be a focus and an investment in building digital literacy skills. And we know my colleagues, Amanda Burks and Shilcock, has written some pieces around how getting back to disproportionate impact on Black and Brown students, how Black and Brown students and adults, how they have disproportionate digital literacy skills. So that is one driver in the decline in community college enrollment. The other driver, like I said, we have to remember that community college tuition has gone up, and the jobs, the part-time jobs, even if folks lost a job in previous recessions that was full-time, they might have gotten a part-time job to help them while they enrolled in community college. Those part-time jobs may not be there because this, once again, where we are in this recession, it's taken a disproportionate toll on the restaurants, the hospitality industries, those kinds of part-time jobs. So that's another factor that is driving that decline in community college enrollment. And number three, the last thing I think I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up is the nature of this recession in the fact of uncertainty, right? People not knowing how long this pandemic was going to last and what industries were going to be in demand on the other side of it, right? And I think was incumbent on a lot of us, and particularly on policymakers, is funding the kinds of initiatives that allow people to have access to data on what jobs are in demand, what training is in demand for those jobs, even in the midst of this recession, because there are pockets of industries that are still hiring workers right now, still in need of workers right now. Warehousing, IT, healthcare, there are still pockets of those industries that still need workers right now. So those are the things that I would bring out.
Dr. Verret, much has been said when we look at, for instance, the census, the quote unquote browning of America, the decline relative in terms of the white population, but the growing population, specifically of Hispanics in this country. And one of the alarming trends and one of the concerns is that to the extent that underprivileged students, underrepresented students, they're falling completely out of the higher education pipeline. There may not be enough workers, to really, and may not be enough workers who have the skills necessary to fill some of these jobs, high-paying, high-wage, high-technology jobs. And so we've talked historically about, we import talent, but is that necessary, right? Because we know that a child that has equal opportunity, irrespective of race or any other factor, if they have equal opportunity, they will make it at equal levels. And so the question, Dr. Verret, is the whole issue of communicating the value proposition of a higher education amid this pandemic. Many people aren't seeing it. They're not seeing it. They're not seeing the payoff to spending, to Melissa's point, this money and more money. And so I was wondering if you talk about, Dr. Verret, this issue of communicating the value proposition and policy-wise, what should be done with regards to making the case that it's worth it, credential, certificate, associate, bachelor's, master. There is a value proposition there, but I'm not sure to the extent it's being communicated. Policy-wise, Dr. Verret, what do you think should happen and needs to happen with regards to communicating a value proposition when it comes to higher education?
Policy-wise, it would have to be among many of our leaders, especially at the national and also at our state levels, who have to be speaking this talk. Because what you are saying, that there's a value proposition and that there's talent and gift in these young people, I'm not sure everyone believes it. And I would say that in America, the assumption that there are certain people, there are certain classes that should aspire to the highest level of education, and others should aspire to low-level tasks. And I would encourage anyone to actually look at Isabella Wilkinson's new book on caste. That you can see that in our history, that basically the assumption that menial tasks belong to certain people and that the higher levels of the society belongs to some. That we frame that in how we offer higher education. That is an issue. It is quite true that it is necessary to actually invite talent from abroad to come to the United States. That's an opportunity. But actually, there are limits to that talent, to that source of talent. We know that the countries that send many talented young women and men to study in the United States want to repatriate their brains. They want to bring them back to develop their economies. So if we do not educate these young people who are now primarily, if we look at our third grades and fourth grade, we are majority minority, that is the talent. That is the richest natural resource that any country has, its young people. If we don't develop those young people, we put ourselves at risk. And so the argument to our leadership, to our educational institutions, is that this is the source that you have to mine and develop. But that has not been historically what America has done, because America has assumed that the darker brother belongs in a separate place, which is why we see these structures that Tomas mentioned that are not just in education, but they are across all sectors of society. But now there is a self-interest argument that is on both sides. It's bipartisan right now. that they realize that to develop our economy, to actually attract jobs to my city, New Orleans, or to any other city, we need to have talented young people at all levels of education. That means we have to cultivate that source, which means giving them the best education possible, which means great teachers, investing in that. That is necessary. Because as you can see, the limits of importing by H-1B will reach a limit. So you have to be able to educate your own. 60% of PhDs in the STEM fields are not US citizens, which means from a national security sector, they cannot get national security clearance to do classified work. Take one example. But other countries want them. But the talent that you have is among these young people, and we have seen it before. And in our institution, what we see, because we're not primarily a selective institution, what we have historically seen is the talent that we draw from Black and brown K through 12 schools who go on to do great things at all levels. But so I think there is a discussion that we need to have, along with the race and equity piece, that to speak about the talent and the gifts of our brown and Black children. Because if that leadership speaks in other ways that it is just for us, what happens just for us becomes a dangerous thing. Even as we're seeing, and COVID is a clear example. Initially, we began by speaking of the higher exposure of Black and brown folk. But now the disease is now in our rural sectors, in communities that are primarily white. So in other words, there is no protection by basically marginalizing just the darker brother.
And Tomas, one of your reports, interestingly, spoke about looking at, for instance, the economics discipline, right? The fact that we know how important it is to be looking at economics from the perspective of underrepresented minorities, but that discipline, I think you noted, is increasingly white, 0 to nil representation, or very, very low representation. And so, as we talk about this issue of value proposition, I see that this is just a critical issue, because I think that many young people, Black and brown, don't see it. They don't see it. They don't see themselves represented in these high wage, high demand jobs. They don't necessarily have the resources, the means, to be able to do it themselves. And so there is no impetus in many cases to make the sacrifices that are necessary. Melissa talked about, many of these community college students being parents. Even myself, I'm looking at the bill, for my broadband access, and I have to, I'm like, wow, if I don't have it, why am I going to be paying this, right? There are so many barriers that it seems that need to be overcome. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, Tomas, this issue of how the value proposition, not only of these majors that you see don't see Black and brown students majoring in, but even going to college at all, getting a certificate, getting a credential. We know there are vocational programs that lead to high wage jobs that even those we're not seeing Black and brown students going to as much anymore. I was wondering if you talk about this issue of value proposition and what can be done to make the case and to help level the playing field, because the concern is that there's been progress made, but we could fall back to worse when we started. So I was wondering if you talk a little bit about this whole value proposition issue, Tomas.
Yes, definitely. No, I think it's really important, and we can think about it, I think, in terms of sort of pull factors and push factors, right? So I think the factors you're mentioning about, access to broadband, access to some of this information, it's really important. It's like it's hard to think about how these institutions, either large colleges, smaller community colleges, or even kind of vocational schools could address those issues, right? So that's a little bit like outside of the scope of the things that they can change. But there's a lot of things, a lot of pull factors that can be changed, right? There could be, I think, some solutions that are potential to try to address this inequality and like both the access and like choices of field of study for higher education could be something. The colleges could have informational campaigns, right? Or to try to get students into these different types of fields. Or there could be an effort to have more faculty of color, right? I think my own experience as an economics student was that all my professors were very white, and I had some professors. Just one quick anecdote was I had a professor that taught me Latin American, topics for Latin American economics, and he was a guy that was apparently very proud of being an expert in Latin America without ever having visited Latin America. And he would brag about this during class, and I would just be like, well, why should I respect this guy's opinion on this? I guess he's an academic on it. He definitely knows more than me, but he doesn't really seem to respect our background as much, right? So I could have seen that moment as a moment where I could be discouraged and just kind of like be like, well, maybe economics is not for me, right? And I think that probably happens a lot to a lot of students of color that have the talent to get into these fields, but they just feel like they don't belong, right? Or they're made to feel like they don't belong because of the way the faculty composition is, and maybe their own viewpoints are, right? So I think those are the types of levers, right? And I'm not a college administrator, so I can't really tell you about how hard it is to do these things. Of course, like Dr. Verret can tell you more about that. But I think just kind of broadly speaking, trying to have more, kind of scouting out those talented students of color, right, that would be successful in STEM, that you just need to be sort of supported in the right way and given the right role models to be taken into these institutions. I think that's one avenue where we can try to like find a little bit more, I think more could be done in that regard. With regard to sort of that's one specific population, right? Kind of like this high talent, high potential population. I think there's a whole other issue with like whole population that is a little bit more vulnerable among Black and brown students, right? That they are maybe not going to make it into the Harvards and the Princetons of the world, but we still need to try to get them into these vocational programs as you're mentioning, these community college programs to try to improve their labor market opportunities. I think the evidence shows thus far that like financial aid and just kind of aid, to try to address these issues with access to broadband or like all of these kind of inputs to education that you really need to succeed. In any way that the government, either the state or federal government can support the students or maybe the institution itself if it's able to, I think that maybe those would be like the more effective paths, but I'm definitely open to my fellow panelists here if they have a different opinion, because this is just kind of coming from me and reading a lot of academic papers, and I know that a lot of the times the academic evidence and the pragmatic kind of issues that are actually happening out in the ground, there's some divide with that. So that's why I'm really glad that we're all sitting here to kind of hash these things out.
I think Tomas should be a college administrator.
Yeah, Dr. Verret, I was wondering if you might want to jump in. We're about to get into Q&A, but any reaction?
If I could jump just quickly, yeah. I would say that I just want to point out something which Tomas would be aware of. Right now, in the average of the U.S. right now, the average U.S. high school, we have one guidance counselor for every 500 child. In my Life Prep school down the street, there's a conversation about your college aspiration goals in the 9th grade before you begin. For many of many other students, that college conversation begins somewhere at the end of the junior year or maybe in the senior year. In other words, different sort of mentoring and direction about what are the options and possibilities given your gifts and talents. Not even a conversation about what are your passions and your gifts, which needs to occur. So in other words, we need to actually restructure the experience of students in K-12, because that number of 1 to 500 and the ASCA, I think, recommends somewhere like 1 to 250. But in most of those great schools, I'm talking about Bronx High School of Science, whether we're talking about 1 to 50, 1 to 100. So in other words, the ratio is much closer. So we're having those intimate conversations about what are your dreams, young man, young woman. That's a piece that's important. The other piece I think we also think about is that even though many of our students are first generation, their parents have not aspired to college. There's a piece that is missing that we also need to actually help to educate our parents, to give them the tools to be the representative for their daughter or son. The same way that I would expect them to be their representative for their daughter or son with a pediatrician. To actually give them a sense of exactly what is the pathway for this child, this freaky gifted child, to college. Because if I never saw, I cannot guide that child. So we need to be mentorship opportunities, not just for the child, but for the parent, because it is, most of us are here because we all had an honorary mother or father. That's why we're here. So how we empower our parents to stand, especially in the face of authority, the teachers and authority, the doctors and authority. You need a parent who can stand in front of that authority and make demands. So there are things missing that if you think about the child living on Park Avenue or other nice neighborhoods around the country, parents are making demands of the schools, not the other way around. So we need to empower them to do that. But also there needs to be a structure even in our K through 12, in our high schools and even our middle schools that begins to actually develop children on a pathway to go to their higher aspirations. I don't think all of our children get that.
Agreed.
All right. Well, thanks so much, panelists. I have a question for you, and I think we'll probably have to close this excellent discussion. I just wonder, what story do you like reporters to cover tomorrow on this topic?
So I can jump in here because I have many ideas. I think that two things. First, I think that I would love to see more deep dives into not only the pockets of success stories. Usually I've seen stories where the pockets of success where people are enrolling in college at this time, or enrolling in training and then they got a new career. That is just a small part of the story that's about the broader narrative. I'd love to see more deep dives into what made the success happen, like what were the policies, what were the actors who came to bring it together. I would love to see that part. And then I would just, of course, love to see more attention to the profiles of college students now, right? We know about the traditional students, but also the students who are, right, it's lifelong learning now. Average age of community college students is 29. So the profiles of what students are facing, why we have these declining community college enrollment numbers, I'd love to see more stories on that end.
I'd like to, one story that I think would be worth exploring, the workforce needs of our emerging discipline, of our emerging areas, whether it's a high tech, whether it's health, to actually write about the gap that we have unsatisfied if we do not marshal the talents of those Black and brown kids. There was some analysis almost 20 years ago of that to show the gaps in whether in computer science, in other disciplines, where we're not developing enough talent to be able to fill those gaps. And I think that analysis is important. The other one that I think is worth discussing is to talk about stories about our workforce efforts, our focus of workforce on college education, and dichotomy between expecting college to prepare students for jobs or careers. That's not a subtle point, but I think it's important because very often the careers that these students go into don't even exist today yet. But they have to be prepared. They have a broader set of knowledge. There are chemists who become lawyers. There are people who are engineers who become entrepreneurs. But the wherewithal to be ready for those careers is important. That's something much more lifelong. We tend to focus on the first job. Most college students get their first jobs eventually. But the job is not the focus, because the job is almost like tying a student to a limited horizon. So I think that conversation about careers and jobs, I think we tend to get focused on jobs. And that may be a Chamber of Commerce piece. We want cogs in the wheel. But the life of these students is actually much broader than that. So we need to think about what prepares them for careers, because a changing economy means that they have to be plastic and go and be able to adapt as the environment changes. That's what college prepares them for.
Yeah, if I would chime in real quick, I definitely agree with everything that's been said. One thing that I think I would like to see a story on is kind of this story about the struggle right during the pandemic, very much like Melissa was saying, and maybe I'll focus on a story of, you know, a kid that is called potential or current college student that is doing everything right, and yet still things are difficult, right? So I think that's something that I think is important to sort of have in our mind, that it's not just about, you know, whether the kid is motivated or not, or whether they have the vision or not. They could have the vision and the brains and all the effort and all of that, and today that might not be enough, right? And that would be tragic, right? And like, how can we devise some sort of intervention to sort of protect this generation, this cohort, from some sort of long-term impact of having had to be exposed to the pandemic at some critical time during their education pathway? I think that's important too.
And real quickly, Lori, I'll just add one more thing. We just released a Skills for an Inclusive Economic Recovery agenda, and to tie these things together, like, I invite people to test us on that, right? Like, we think these are policies that will work to build a more equitable workforce. Like, I would love to see journalists like test that out with seeing where these policies have been in place and have worked for people.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for your wonderful discussion. David, thank you so much for your excellent moderation. Tomas, Melissa, and Dr. Verret, thank you for your insights. And thank you, everybody, for participating. I just have a couple of important announcements. First, please give us feedback about the session by clicking on the Rate the Session button, which will open a new window with short survey. It's really important for us to hear from you. Second, we invite everyone to join us afterward for a quick, laid-back 15-minute follow-up conversation. The EWA Ideas Lab is an informal roundtable to brainstorm story ideas, share research tips, and to discuss writing challenges. This session will be led by the marvelous Eva Marie Ayala, education editor at the Dallas Morning News. Please join her in the lab by clicking on the link in your Whova agenda. Thanks again, everyone. Thank you so much, speakers, for your wonderful discussion. And we'll see you soon.